They broke her bones for fun. Then the mountain man vows to break them twice as slow. The unforgiving mountain pass was a realm of silent executioners, radiating stark desolation, brutal indifference, and a primal biting fear. Maeve no longer felt the cold. Pain was a white-hot fire that had burned all other sensation to ash. She crawled, one hand then the other, her fingers raw and bleeding into the snow. Her left leg dragged behind at an angle God never intended a testament to her escape. But she was fueled by more than just true grit. She was fueled by the memory of their laughter, the sound they made as her bones snapped. Ahead, a single point of light flickered in the descending gloom, a ghost of a chance, a lone cabin. Her bloody fingers finally touched rough-hewn wood. She clawed at the door, once a ragged, desperate sound before the world went black. From within, a heavy bolt scraped and the door creaked open, revealing a shadow that blotted out the light. What kind of monster laughs at breaking bones? And what kind of man lives where only monsters dare to tread? Let me know your theories in the comments below. The silence of the high peaks was a kind of prayer, a benediction of wind and ice offered up to a god he no longer believed in. Inside the cabin, Gideon moved with the economy of a man who had whittled his life down to the essentials: fire, shelter, solitude. The world below could burn for all he cared. He had left its ashes on his boots a decade ago. He oiled the rifle not for a hunt, but for the ritual. The scent of gun oil and pine smoke was the only incense he knew. Each motion was deliberate, a way to occupy hands that had once broken things with terrifying ease. He had come to these unforgiving heights to bury that man, to let the cold and the quiet leach the violence from his soul. He almost believed it had worked. Then he heard it. A sound that did not belong. It wasn't the groan of the pines under their burden of snow. It wasn't the cry of a hawk. It was a scratching, faint, desperate, a sound like a dying animal clawing at his door. He froze, the oiled rag still in his hand. His first instinct was primal and cold: ignore it. The mountain was a harsh god, and it demanded its sacrifices. Whatever was out there was a problem for the wolves, not for him. The scratching came again, weaker this time, followed by a soft, final thud. Silence returned, but now it was different. It was an accusatory silence. Cursing under his breath, Gideon rose the floorboards, groaning as he crossed the small room. He threw the heavy iron bolt, a sound like a cracking bone in the quiet, and pulled the door inward. The wind howled a physical blow, whipping snow into the room. But it was the shape crumpled on his doorstep that stole the air from his lungs. It was a woman, or what was left of one. Her dark cloak was torn, her hair a frozen mat of blood and ice. One leg was bent beneath her at an angle that defied nature, the splintered bone a pale, obscene slash against the crimson-stained snow. It was the work of men. And Gideon knew the work of men all too well. He moved without thinking, a reflex from a life he had tried to forget. He scooped her up. She weighed nothing, a bundle of shattered bone and frozen fabric, and carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the storm. He laid her on the bearskin rug before the hearth, the firelight dancing over a face pale as death, bruised a deep and violent purple along her jaw. Her lips were blue, her breathing a shallow, rattling whisper. A life played out to its last desperate card. He worked with a grim, detached efficiency, cutting away the frozen rags of her dress to assess the damage. He was no doctor, but he knew broken things. Her arm was shattered, her ribs a landscape of deep, brutalized bruises. He fetched his last bottle of whiskey, not for drinking, but for cleaning the wounds, and a roll of clean linen. As the raw spirit touched a long gash on her forehead, her eyes fluttered open. They were wild, unfocused, trapped in a nightmare that was still playing out behind them. No. The word was a ghost of a breath. Please. No more. You're safe. Gideon growled the words, feeling foreign and rough in his own ears. He didn't do comfort. He didn't do safety. You're away from them. Her eyes finally focused on his face, and a fresh wave of terror washed over her. She tried to scramble back, a choked sob catching in her throat. Who? It doesn't matter, he said, his voice flat. What happened to you? She stared at him, at the firelight glinting in his hard eyes, at the jagged scar that cut through his left eyebrow. The terror subsided, replaced by a vast, empty landscape of pain. Tears, frozen on her lashes, began to melt and trace clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. Her voice, when it came, was a broken, rattling thing, a whisper that would haunt him for the rest of his days. They broke them. She took a shuddering breath. My bones. They broke my bones. For fun. Her body trembled, not from cold, but from the memory. They laughed, she choked out. God, they laughed. Gideon stopped moving. The linen fell from his hand. The world narrowed to that one horrific word. Laughed. He had heard men laugh like that before, a lifetime ago. In the darkest corners of his own soul, he remembered that he too had once known how. A cold, familiar rage began to uncoil in his gut. It was a serpent. He thought he had starved to death, but it had only been sleeping. He looked at his own hands, large, scarred, and suddenly trembling. He rose and walked to the far side of the cabin, to a heavy wooden footlocker that had sat unopened for 10 years. The dust on its lid was a thick, undisturbed shroud. He knelt before it, the key feeling heavy and damning in his palm. He turned the lock. The click was deafening. Inside, beneath a folded Confederate gray coat, lay not medical supplies but a coiled leather gun belt, its holster worn smooth from a fast draw. The pistol within it was a Colt, dark and heavy, a killing tool. He had buried a monster on this mountain, and a girl's broken whisper had just handed him the shovel to dig it back up. Maeve woke to the unfamiliar scent of wood smoke and old iron. Pain was the first language her body spoke, a dull, thrumming dialect of ache that had replaced the sharp, screaming agony of before. The world swam into focus slowly. Rough-hewn wooden walls, a low ceiling, the dying orange glow of a hearth, and the man. He was slumped in a chair across the small room, his massive frame folded into something resembling sleep. His head was bowed, his face shadowed by a grizzled beard, but the firelight glinted off the object on the table beside his hand. A pistol. Dark and heavy and absolute. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She was traded from one monster to another. Her breath caught in her throat, a tiny panicked sound. But then her eyes took in the rest of the scene. The stiff, expertly tied splint on her leg. The clean linen bandage wrapped around her forearm. The bearskin rug she lay upon, protecting her from the cold floor. A killer's hands had somehow performed a healer's work. The contradiction was a dizzying puzzle her mind couldn't solve. She was a broken thing, yet he had not left her for the wolves. Why, the memory was a phantom limb aching where nothing was left. A log in the hearth shifted, sending a sharp crack into the silence. The sound was a key unlocking a door in her mind she was desperate to keep bolted. Crack! The sound of her own fibula snapping under a man's heavy boot. The forest floor rushing up to meet her face. The smell of pine needles and damp earth. And the laughter, a high braying sound full of rot-gut whiskey and casual cruelty. Another man joins in his a deep rumbling chuckle. They were having fun. This was a sport, her body the playing field. She gasped, the air in the cabin suddenly thin, the walls pressing in. She was back there, her face in the dirt, the laughter raining down on her like blows. No. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing the images away. She focused on the real. The rough texture of the bearskin beneath her fingers. The weight of the blanket on her chest. The steady, slow breathing of the man in the chair. He had not hurt her. Not yet. He stirred his head, lifting slowly. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, found hers in the dim light. They held no warmth, but the active malice of her tormentors was also absent. They were simply ancient, weary. "You're awake." His voice was a low rumble like rocks grinding together. "Don't move the leg." He pushed himself to his feet, a mountain of a man unfolding in the small space. He stoked the fire, his movements sure and economical. He was all grim purpose, a creature of this harsh, lonely place. He gestured with his chin toward a bucket of water and a strip of dried meat on a wooden plate. "There's water. Food." Maeve flinched as he reached for the pistol, strapping the gun belt around his hips with a familiar ease that spoke of a long and bloody acquaintance. "Where are you going?" The whisper was torn from her throat. He paused at the door, pulling on a heavy winter cloak. He looked back at her, his face an unreadable mask of stone. "Hunting." The single word hung in the air, cold and sharp as an icicle. It was not a deer he was going to hunt. She knew it. He knew it. It was an unspoken pact sealed in her broken bones and his simmering rage. "Bolt the door behind me," he ordered. "Don't open it for anyone." Then he was gone, swallowed by the morning's gray light, leaving her utterly alone. The silence he left behind was a terrifying gaping wound. She was alone with her ghosts, with the echo of that laugh. For a long moment she lay there, a prisoner of her own broken body. She could die here. It would be easy. Just close her eyes and let the pain take her. But the memory of their faces twisted in mirth was a spur. They would not win. They would not have the last laugh. With a groan that was half pain, half defiance, she began to move. The journey from the floor to a sitting position against the wall was an epic of agony. Sweat beaded on her forehead. The world swam in dizzying circles. But she did it. She reached the plate, her trembling fingers closing around the strip of jerky. It tasted of salt and smoke and survival. It was the best thing she had ever eaten. She was a body they had broken for sport, but a soul was something they couldn't touch. As the day bled into the deep bruised purple of dusk, a new fear began to creep in. The wind rose its voice, a low moan around the corners of the cabin. A wolf howled in the distance, a lonely, predatory sound that vibrated through the floorboards. The door. He had told her to bolt the door. It was 10 feet away, an impossible distance. She looked at the heavy iron bolt, her only shield against the vast, hungry wilderness. She had to reach it. She began to crawl. Dragging her splinted leg was a fresh torment, each inch a victory paid for in a fresh wave of fire. The floorboards scraped her raw hands. Tears of frustration and pain streamed down her face, but she didn't make a sound. Noise was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her fingers finally brushed against the cold, rough wood of the door. With the last of her strength, she pushed herself up her hand, closing around the iron bolt. It was heavy, stiff with rust. She threw her entire weight into it. Schlick! The sound echoed in the cabin, loud as a gunshot, a sound of imprisonment, a sound of safety, a sound of her own will made real. She slumped against the door, her body screaming, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She had done it. She was safe. For now. And as she sat there in the darkness, listening to the howl of the wind, another sound reached her. It was distant, carried on the mournful song of the pines. A single human scream cut brutally short. Gideon's hunt had begun. The forest had swallowed the scream, leaving only a profound and ringing silence. Gideon stood over the body of the first man, his breath pluming white in the frigid air. The snow around the corpse was a canvas of violence, a dark, arterial red soaking into the pristine white. A debt collected. A down payment. He felt nothing. That was the lie he told himself. What he truly felt was a grim, hollow echo of a skill he had prayed to forget. He was good at this. The planning, the tracking, the final brutal punctuation. He was too good. He turned his back on the body, leaving it for the scavengers and the spring thaw. The man's name did not matter. His face was just one of a set. There were more. He knew the next two would be harder. Fear had been sent down the mountain like an avalanche, and scared men were like cornered wolverines, stupid, but armed with teeth and claws. He cut a wide circle, finding their panicked tracks leading away from the town and toward the temporary chaos of a winter logging camp. A place of loud noises and rough men, a place they thought they could get lost. But you couldn't get lost from a man like Gideon. He was the wilderness. He was the cold. He was the thing that comes for you in the deep and silent woods. He watched the camp from a high ridge for a full day, a ghost in the pines. He learned its rhythms. The morning groan of the saws, the midday shouts of the foreman, the evening migration to the roaring fire where men drank away the chill and the misery of their lives. He saw them there, Cletus and Finn. They drank deeper than the rest, their laughter too loud, their eyes darting constantly toward the dark tree line. They were trying to outrun a ghost, unaware it was watching them from above. He waited for the dusk, for the long, deep shadows that were his allies. The work of a man like Gideon is not done in the light. He moved when the great steam donkey engine let out a deafening hiss of pressure, its noise covering his descent. He found Finn first relieving himself behind a stack of freshly cut timber away from the fire's light. The man shivered, though not from the cold. Gideon didn't speak. He simply stepped from the shadows. Finn turned his eyes, widening in recognition of a nightmare made flesh. His hand scrabbled for the pistol at his hip. I didn't, he stammered. Gideon's movement was a blur, faster than a striking snake. He closed the distance, his hand clamping over Finn's mouth, stifling the scream. The other hand delivered a single precise, devastating blow to the man's throat. There was a sickening crunch of cartilage. Finn's eyes bulged with silent final surprise before he crumpled into a lifeless heap. It was quiet. It was efficient. It was the work he used to do. He left the body and melted back into the shadows. Now there was one. Cletus was getting nervous. He paced by the fire, calling Finn's name, his voice tight with a rising panic. He was drawing his pistol, his eyes sweeping the darkness. He was making himself a target. Gideon let him stew in his own terror for 10 long minutes, letting the man's imagination do half the work. Then he stepped into the edge of the firelight, just enough to be seen. He's not coming back, Cletus. Cletus spun around his pistol, shaking in his hand. Who are you? What do you want? Gideon took another slow step forward, his face a mask of cold judgment. You know what I want? You were there, with the girl. It wasn't me. It was Jedediah's idea. All of it. The words tumbled out a pathetic, cowardly torrent. I just watched, I swear to God, did you laugh? Gideon's voice was dangerously quiet, cutting through the man's blubbering. Cletus stared, his mouth hanging open, confusion warring with his terror. What? She said you laughed. Gideon repeated the words, flat and heavy as tombstones. That was all he said. Cletus tried to raise the pistol, but his terror had made him slow. Gideon was not slow. The ensuing sound was not a gunshot, but a series of dull, heavy impacts followed by the wet, snapping sound of a man being systematically dismantled. It was not a quick death. Later, alone in the vast, echoing silence of the forest, the adrenaline faded, leaving the bitter dregs of memory. He wasn't just a mountain man defending a wronged woman. That was the new lie he was telling himself. The truth was colder. The precise, brutal efficiency he had just displayed wasn't learned from hunting elk. It was learned in the back alleys of St. Louis and the rail yards of Chicago as an enforcer for a man whose name was a poison on his tongue. He had been paid to break men then for profit and power. He was hunting monsters, but he was using a monster's tools. The long walk back to the cabin was a pilgrimage through his own past. He moved through the snow-laden trees, the ghosts of the men he'd killed for money walking beside the ghosts of the men he'd just killed for something else. Justice, vengeance. He didn't know the difference anymore. He only knew the girl's voice whispering in his mind. They laughed. As dawn threatened to break, staining the eastern sky, a pale, bruised violet, the cabin came into view. He was exhausted, the old violence leaving him feeling hollowed out and raw. He pushed the door open, a half-formed apology on his lips for leaving her alone for so long. He stopped dead in the doorway. The fire was blazing in the hearth, chasing the shadows into the corners. And Maeve was not huddled on the floor. She was sitting upright in the chair, his heavy wool cloak wrapped around her shoulders. His rifle was laid across her lap. Her hands were steady, and her eyes fixed on the door held not the terror of a victim, but the fierce, wary vigilance of a survivor. The man who filled the cabin doorway was not the same one who had left it. The hunter had returned, ancient and weary, wearing the ghosts of his work like a second cloak. Maeve's hands tightened on the rifle in her lap. The cold, heavy steel felt less like a weapon and more like an extension of her own newfound spine. She did not lower it. Gideon's stormy eyes met hers. He saw the gun, the set of her jaw, the fierce vigilance in her gaze. He didn't command her to put it down. He simply gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement before turning to shut the door, bolting it against the world. A silent message passed between them in that moment. This is our fortress now. We defend it together. The days that followed were a quiet, fragile truce with the world. Gideon was a creature of silent routine. He would disappear for hours, a ghost, melting into the snow-choked pines, returning with firewood or a freshly snared rabbit. He never spoke of where he went or what he did. He didn't have to. Maeve could see the answer in the way he cleaned his Colt by the firelight, his movements economical and grim, and in the fresh tension that lined his jaw. He was a sentinel pacing the borders of their tiny, isolated world. She in turn focused on the small, monumental task of healing. Each day she pushed herself further, first sitting up without the world spinning into a black vortex. Then, standing leaning on the rough-hewn table, her splinted legs screaming in protest. She learned the geography of the cabin, the 3 paces from the hearth to the table, the 5 paces from her bearskin rug to the door. It was her entire universe, and she was determined to be its master. One evening he returned and dropped 2 plump ptarmigans on the table. Their white feathers were like a piece of the snow itself brought indoors. "You know how to dress these?" He rumbled, his voice rough from disuse. Maeve looked at the birds, and a memory, one that wasn't soaked in terror, flickered to life. A kitchen that smelled of baking bread, her father's large, gentle hands guiding her own. "My father taught me," she said, her own voice surprising her with its steadiness. They ate that night in near silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the scrape of knives on wooden plates. But the quiet was not empty. It was filled with a shared, unspoken truth. He was a killer, and she was his reason. She was broken, and he was her unlikely protector. They were 2 sides of the same brutal coin forged in the same fire. The piece, like a thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark river, was never meant to last. One afternoon Gideon returned, and the air on the mountain changed. He didn't carry game. He carried a storm in his eyes. He moved to the single window, peering down the long, wooded slope. "He knows," Gideon set his back to her, "or he's getting close." "How?" Maeve asked, her hand instinctively going to the wooden crutch he had carved for her. "Tracks. Not mine. 3 men moving smart, fanning out, and something else." He turned from the window, his face grim. "Found this, pinned to a tree, at the old trading post down the valley." He tossed a crumpled piece of paper onto the table. It was a crude, hand-drawn bounty poster. It depicted a snarling, brutish man with a scar, a caricature of Gideon. and beneath it the words, "Wanted for the kidnapping of Maeve O'Connell." Abductor is armed and dangerous. Generous reward for her safe return to her loving fiancé, Jedediah Croft. The lie was so audacious, so perverse it stole her breath. He had twisted her torment into a story of romantic rescue, painting Gideon as the villain and himself as the hero. He wasn't just coming for them with guns. He was coming for them with the full righteous fury of the law, bought and paid for by his father's gold. A cold rage, clean and sharp, cut through her fear. "He thinks I'm a prize to be won back," she whispered, her voice trembling, not with weakness, but with a sudden venomous strength. "He thinks I'm still just a broken doll he can put back on his shelf." Gideon looked at her, then truly looked at her, and he saw the change. The frightened girl he had carried from the snow was gone. In her place was a woman forged in pain, with eyes that held the hard, clear light of sharpened steel. He saw a survivor. That night, a blizzard descended on the peak, a howling vortex of wind and snow that sealed them in the cabin. The storm was a temporary shield, a wall between them and Jedediah's men. They sat by the fire, the world outside a raging white chaos. "He's patient," Gideon said into the quiet. "He'll wait out the storm. Then he'll move in." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and asked the question that mattered more than any bullet or blade. "Tell me about him, Maeve. Not the monster. The man. What does he fear?" He was no longer protecting her. He was consulting her. He was making her a partner in the war to come. Before she could answer, a flicker of light, alien and intrusive, caught her eye through the thick sheet of ice on the window pane. Gideon saw it too. They both rose, moving to the window, peering through a small, clear patch. Far below, on a neighboring peak, a single point of fire bloomed against the swirling darkness. It was an orange eye opening in the heart of the storm. A signal. They had been found. The hunt was over. The siege was about to begin. The signal fire on the distant peak was a death warrant written in flame. Gideon watched it burn, a single malevolent eye in the heart of the blizzard, and felt a cold, familiar calm settle over him. The storm was no longer a shield. It was a cage. He was trapped on this mountain with a healing woman and a past that had finally relentlessly caught up to him. He turned from the window. The cabin, once his impenetrable fortress of solitude, now felt small, fragile, a wooden box waiting to be crushed. He moved with a sudden, violent efficiency, his actions stripped of all wasted motion. He jammed the heavy table against the door, wedged a shutter over the single window, and laid out his ammunition on the rough-hewn mantel. 3 shells for the shotgun. A dozen rounds for the Colt. It wasn't enough. Not for a siege. He looked at Maeve. She hadn't moved. She stood by the hearth, her face illuminated by the fire, her eyes wide, but holding a steady, unblinking light. The question he had asked before the signal fire still hung in the air between them, more important now than any barricade. What does he fear? "Maeve," he repeated, his voice a low growl. She was silent for a long moment, her gaze turned inward, walking through the haunted corridors of her memory. When she finally spoke, her voice was as cold and clear as ice. "He doesn't fear pain," she said. "He gives it too freely to respect it. And he doesn't fear death. He's too arrogant, too certain of his father's power to believe it could ever touch him. Everyone fears something." Gideon insisted, his hands pausing in the act of loading the Colt. Maeve met his gaze, and for the first time he saw not a victim, but a strategist. She had studied her captor. She knew his architecture. "He fears being seen as small," she said, the words precise and sharp. "He is a peacock, a strutting, desperate thing. His father. The old man despises him, sees him as a weakling. Everything Jedediah does is a performance, a desperate play to win the one thing he has never had the old man's respect. He needs an audience. He needs to be seen as the victor, dominant and in complete control." Gideon stared at her, the pieces clicking into place in his mind. He had been planning for a war of attrition, a bloody fight of bullets and blades against superior numbers. He had been planning to fight the way the old Gideon would have fought. Maeve had just handed him a new and far deadlier weapon. You don't fight a man like that with brute force alone. You fight him with mirrors. You build him a stage and let his own vanity be his undoing. A new plan began to form, cold and intricate and terrible. The cabin was no longer a fortress to be defended. It was becoming a theater for a final bloody act. "Help me," he said. It was not a command. It was a request. For the rest of that long storm-racked night they worked. They didn't speak their actions, a silent, fluid dance of shared purpose. He showed her how to use the last of his black powder and a length of fuse to create a crude noisemaker, a diversion. She in turn showed him how Jedediah had bound her wrists, the specific, arrogant knot he used, a knot designed not just to hold, but to chafe and display power. Every detail she provided was another nail for Jedediah's coffin. At one point, as he reached for a heavy log to brace the wall, the old wound in his shoulder, the one he'd ignored since the logging camp, screamed in protest. He winced, a sharp intake of breath he couldn't suppress. Without a word, Maeve took the roll of clean linen from the shelf. "Sit," she said, her voice soft but firm. He hesitated for a second, then obeyed, sinking onto a stool. He watched as her small, steady hands unwrapped the old bandage and cleaned the inflamed wound. Her touch was gentle, practiced, confident. The great protector, the mountain grizzly, was being tended to by the broken bird he had rescued. He felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest, a feeling that had nothing to do with the fire. He didn't pull away. He let her fix what was broken. The blizzard broke with the dawn. The world outside fell into a sudden, muffled silence, the landscape buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. It was beautiful, a deceptive, predatory beauty. Gideon stood at his post by the shuttered window, peering through a small crack. Maeve was on the other side of the room, his rifle resting on the windowsill, her breathing slow and even. They waited. An hour passed. Then he saw them. 3 figures dark against the snow moving up the slope. They weren't charging. They were advancing with the patient tactical precision of experienced manhunters. They fanned out, taking cover surrounding the cabin. Maeve moved to his side, her gaze following his. She could feel the tension radiating from him, a low, dangerous hum. "They're here," she whispered. Gideon looked down at the men below, and for the first time since she had met him, a strange, cold smile touched his lips. "They're not coming to kill us," he said, his voice a low, predatory murmur. "They're coming to take back their prize." He looked at Maeve, his stormy eyes glinting with a terrible newfound light. "Let's make sure he gets what he deserves." The silence of the snow-drowned world was broken by a voice. It was smooth, arrogant, and dripping with a false, cloying sweetness that made Gideon's teeth ache. "Maeve, my darling, it's over. I've come to rescue you from this savage Jedediah." He stood 20 yards from the cabin, bold and confident in the open, his 2 riflemen flanking him from the cover of the pines. He wasn't a soldier. He was a master of ceremonies, and this was his stage. Gideon caught Maeve's eye across the dim cabin. He saw the flicker of ice in her gaze and gave a single sharp nod. "Now." With a steady hand, Maeve touched a lit splinter of wood to the fuse. It sputtered to life. Gideon kicked open the back shutter and hurled the tightly bound packet of black powder out into a snowdrift on the far side of the cabin. The 2 riflemen, their attention fixed on the front door, instinctively swung their barrels toward the sound of the shutter. It was the only opening he would need. The packet exploded with a deafening boom, a geyser of black smoke and white snow erupting into the clean morning air. As the riflemen flinched, turning to fire at the phantom threat, Gideon became an avalanche. He didn't use the door. He burst through the weakened wall of the cabin itself, a primal force of splintered wood and pure, cold fury. He was on the first rifleman before the man could even turn back a silent, brutal takedown that ended in a spray of red against the white snow. The second man saw him, his eyes wide with shock, and tried to bring his rifle to bear. Gideon's old Colt was already in his hand. It barked once. The man collapsed. It took less than 5 seconds. 2 lives extinguished. 2 debts paid. Inside the cabin, Maeve heard the explosion, the single gunshot, then a terrifying silence. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. This was her part of the stage. The door was kicked open, splintering from its frame. Jedediah stood there, silhouetted against the bright snow, his pistol drawn, a triumphant sneer on his handsome face. "There you are," he said, his eyes drinking in the sight of her, seemingly alone and helpless. "The beast is dead, my dear. You're safe." He stepped inside, his arrogance a tangible thing. He saw the rifle in her hands and chuckled. "You can put that down now, my love. The danger has passed." Maeve didn't move. She let a single perfect tear trace a path down her cheek, her body trembling in a masterful performance of fear. You came for me," she whispered. "Of course," he preened, stepping closer, lowering his own pistol. "I would have torn down this mountain with my bare hands to get to you. My father will hear of your bravery," she said, her voice soft and full of broken awe. "He will see what a strong son he has." Jedediah's triumphant smile faltered, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Maeve pressed on her voice, losing its tremble, becoming as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. "Or perhaps he will hear how you let 2 of his hired guns get slaughtered by one old man. He will hear how the simple task he gave you turned into this embarrassing mess. He'll see the weakness he always talks about." The color drained from Jedediah's face. The performance was over. The sneer was gone, replaced by the ugly, contorted mask of pure fury. She had struck the nerve, the raw, festering wound of his father's contempt. "You ungrateful little—" he snarled, lunging for her, his hand raised to strike. He never saw Gideon appear in the broken doorway behind him. Jedediah was yanked backward as if by a phantom hand. He was spun around to face the mountain man, whose eyes were as flat and dead as a winter sky. There was a sharp, wet snap. Jedediah screamed a high, thin sound as his arm broke at the elbow. Gideon shoved him to the floor. Another snap. His leg. Why Jedediah shrieked, writhing on the floor, his arrogance shattered into a million pieces of agony. "Why are you doing this?" Gideon knelt beside him, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, a sound more terrifying than any shout. He leaned in close, so the last thing Jedediah would ever hear clearly was the final settling of his account. "She said you laughed." The aftermath was silence. A profound, ringing quiet broken only by the whimpering of the thing on the floor. Gideon rose, looking at his own hands, not with triumph, but with a deep, bone-weary resignation. The monster had done its work. Maeve slowly lowered the rifle. Her face was a pale, stoic mask, her eyes clear and empty of tears. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor. She was the architect of this brutal final judgment. They stood there for a long time, 2 solitary figures in a wrecked cabin, the scent of blood and gunpowder hanging heavy in the air. Outside, the sun had risen, bathing the pristine, blood-stained snow in a brilliant, unforgiving light. The world was born anew. So were they. Without a word, Gideon turned and began to methodically clean his weapons. Maeve stoked the fire. It was over. The debt was paid. Their future was a blank and silent landscape, as vast and uncertain as the mountain outside their broken door. But whatever came next, they would face it together.